I was born and raised in a traditional Hungarian household in Hungary in the 90s, which means I had a mom who was very quick and powerful at the hands. So I very early on learned not to rock the boat, not to say or do anything that would upset her, and I never talked about anything at all, ever. And eventually I just learned to cope with everything that was hard by pretending that it wasn't happening. And that's exactly how I handled it when I was being bullied at school. And that was happening a lot. I was bullied for being gypsy. Now, it's a really cruel thing to do to a little child, to bully them for something like that. But I was also really confused by this because as far as I knew, I wasn't gypsy. And when I looked in the mirror, I could see why everybody assumed I was. I had a much darker complexion than everybody else around me. And so did my father, but he vehemently denied that we would be gypsies. And I couldn't talk to anybody about this at home, of course. So I just took the bullying and I pretended it didn't happen. And sometimes this bullying got really rough. Like one day in the 3rd grade, when I was outside during recess with my best friend, a little boy named Jusika. He had blonde hair and blue eyes and pale skin, and he was really, really sweet to me, especially on days when I had it rough at school. And we were playing outside during recess, and a girl ran up to us, and she yelled racial slurs at me, and she pushed me down on the ground and spit at me. And as I was sitting there with my palms burning, scraped, I felt my eyes fill up with tears, but I willed myself not to cry. I instead did what I did best, and I closed my eyes, and I pretended that none of this was happening. And for the rest of the day, Jusika and I didn't even mention this incident. But he must have known how bad I felt, because he did offer to walk me home from school that day. And then he asked my mom if he could stay for dinner. And as we were sitting in my mom's kitchen, sharing slices of butter bread and milk, he abruptly broke the silence and announced to my mother what had happened to me at school that day. And in that moment, I just felt so much shame, because the embarrassment I felt when this whole thing initially happened was nothing compared to the shame I felt knowing that my cover was blown, that my friend knew that I felt so embarrassed. So that was too much for me to handle, and I started to cry, and then I was sobbing and hyperventilating and bracing myself for my mom to hit me, because you never know which way that was coming from. And to my surprise, instead of hitting me, my mom actually hit the table. And she yelled at me, "Mit bőgsz? Az a kislány olyan csúnya, mint a seggem kifordítva." Which literally means, why would you be crying about that girl? She's uglier than my asshole inside out. And with that, she turned and walked out of the kitchen. Now, the following day, armed with this traditional piece of Hungarian advice, I returned to school. And eventually recess came, and Jusika and I went back outside, and we tried to hide from this girl, but eventually she found us again and started yelling racial slurs at me again. And by this point, I knew that I wasn't going to defend myself or say anything or talk to a teacher about it. And I really didn't want to cry in front of the whole school. So instead, I just closed my eyes and I pretended again that this wasn't happening. But a moment later, I had to open my eyes because I heard my little friend Jusika right next to me scream at this girl. She doesn't care about what you're saying because you're uglier than my asshole inside out. And it was in that moment that I realized that my family taught me a lot of dysfunctional ways of being, but sometimes mother knows best.